It is August 8th, 1963, 3 minutes past 3 in the morning in the sleepy countryside of Buckinghamshire, England. The sheep bleats in the distance, the only hint of life in this part of the world. The darkness is heavy, pressing down like a damp wool blanket. Mist snakes across the fields, wrapping the trees and hedgerows in ghostly tendrils. Far off, cutting through the thick black, a distant rumble grows louder. A train, but not just any train, clattering and shrieking along the tracks. This is a Royal Mail train carrying letters, parcels, locked inside its battered carriages, over £2.6 million in cash. Jack Mills, the train driver, blinks hard to stay awake. His cabin is hot and stale, smelling of grease and dust. He wipes a hand over his sweaty brow and reaches for his chipped mug of tea. Another long haul from Glasgow to London. Routine, boring, safe, but not tonight. Half a mile ahead, at a lonely stretch of track, near a small battered bridge, known as Bridgo Bridge, something unnatural waits. A red signal flickers in the mist. Jack rubs his eyes. In this part of the world there is never a reason to stop. He engages the engine's brakes and slows to a halt at the foot of the signal box. Parked out of sight behind the bridge's skeletal frame, 2 Land Rovers crouch like hunting beasts. 15 men, faces shadowed under caps, hands gloved, hearts thundering, crouch in the gloom. Every breath puffs a cloud into the cold air. Among them, Ronnie Biggs fidgets, nerves fraying with every passing second. His boots scuff the gravel. This is it. Months of planning, 100 things that could go wrong. One shot. The men move like phantoms, quick, silent, deadly. The moment the wheels lock up and the train groans to a halt under the bridge, Ronnie Biggs moves with them. No longer a petty thief, no longer some South London wide boy. In that moment he steps into history. Before Jack Mills could even wonder what was wrong, they were on him. Boots slammed against metal, shouts tore the night open. Biggs was in the thick of it. Heart pounding, sweat freezing on his skin. 15 men, moving with military precision, surged forward. 2 masked figures hauled open the driver's cabin door. Mills turned in his seat, confusion flashing to fear, and then crack. The cosh landed with a sickening, fleshy thud against his skull. Mills slumped forward, a groan leaking from his throat. Blood trickled down his temple, dark as oil in the moonlight. He wasn't dead, but he was out of the fight. The attackers dragged him roughly from his seat, letting him crumple onto the cold floor of the cab. Biggs felt a twist in his gut watching it. He hadn't signed up for blood, but this wasn't the time for second thoughts. This was the job. No turning back. Inside the carriages, postal workers shouted, confused, trying to rally. The gang was faster. They poured into the train like a river of shadows, rough hands grabbing, dragging men down, barking threats. No guns, but fists flew. Boots crashed into ribs. Shouts turned to cries. Cries turned to silence. Within minutes, the Royal Mail train was theirs. Out came the leather bags, heavy, bulging, full of untraceable cash. The gang passed them hand to hand like sacred relics, hurling them into the waiting Land Rovers with the urgency of men pulling treasure from a sinking ship. Every second counted. Every second that mist thickened, every distant sound could be the coppers coming down on them. Ronnie Biggs heaved the weight of the bags with shaking arms, feeling every note in them, feeling fortune slipping into his fingers. He wasn't a soldier, wasn't a killer, but tonight, under the dripping bones of Bridgo Bridge, he was a king. By 3:20 a.m, the train sat abandoned, gutted. The gang vanished into the mist with their spoils, leaving behind a wounded driver, a battered crew, and the bruised body of the Royal Mail itself. Biggs stumbled into the Land Rover, heart thundering in his ears, soaked in sweat. As the engine growled to life and they roared away into the dark, he risked a look back. The train, the bridge, the broken night, already shrinking into memory. No going back now. They were ghosts on the wind, and the whole bloody country would wake up screaming by morning. Leatherslade Farm lay forgotten at the end of a narrow lane, surrounded by ragged fields and broken fences, the kind of place even time had abandoned. It was quiet out there, unnervingly so, the sort of quiet that makes a man start to hear his own heartbeat. It was perfect. The trucks pulled up before dawn, engines coughing once, before the silence swallowed them whole. The gang moved quickly, heavy boots on rotting floorboards, faces tense but giddy with the taste of success. Inside, the farmhouse reeked of damp wood and mouse droppings, but they barely noticed. They had made it. They were rich now, richer than they could have imagined. The kitchen table, crusted with grime and old stains, was cleared in a heartbeat, and out came the loot. Bag after bag split open, and a river of banknotes poured across the table and onto the floor, the air filled with the musty, almost sweet smell of old money. 2.6 million, counted in sweaty hands, stacked in neat towers like the ruins of some lost civilization. Ronnie Biggs sat cross-legged on the floor, his arms elbow-deep in cash, grinning like a man who had just cheated death. He took his cut without ceremony, dragging a mound of notes toward him, while the others worked feverishly through the piles. None of them thought much about the need for caution. Gloves were tugged off, glasses were lifted with bare hands, greasy fingerprints were left on cutlery, doors, walls. Their minds were elsewhere, already spending what they hadn't even finished counting. The plan was to lie low for weeks, letting the world burn itself out chasing phantoms. Leatherslade Farm, hidden by distance and disrepair, was supposed to be the perfect place to disappear. But boredom is a poison, slow and invisible, and it seeped into the farm almost immediately. The mattresses were damp, the food was spoiled, and the night stretched on forever, filled with the rustling of rats and the creaking of the old beams. The damp crawled into their bones. The silence gnawed at their nerves. Biggs, never a man built for patience, grew restless first. He spoke of leaving, muttering about day trips and fresh air, while others quietly agreed. The safe house, once a fortress, was beginning to feel like a trap. One by one, they began slipping away for short trips, careless in their movements, leaving a trail of crumbs for the world to follow. Ronnie Biggs wasn't thinking about fingerprints when he wiped the sweat from his forehead and grabbed a pint in town. He wasn't thinking about muddy boot prints leading away from the farm, or the whispers that began swirling around the nearby villages. But while they dreamed, the noose was tightening. Scotland Yard was starting to piece together the scraps, the little mistakes that pride and boredom had left behind. After the Great Train Robbery in 1963, Biggs did manage to vanish for a few months. He did the safe houses, the plastic surgery, the running around. In 1963, after a few months on the run, he was caught in England. Scotland Yard raided one of the safe houses, and they pulled Biggs in with a handful of other gang members. In 1964, Ronnie was sentenced to 30 years in prison, a brutal sentence designed to make an example of him. London, 1964. The cell at Wandsworth Prison was a cramped, lifeless box, the air thick with sweat, hopelessness, and the quiet groan of men who knew they'd never walk free again. Ronnie Biggs, once so quick with a grin and quicker with his hands, now paced the tiny space like a caged fox, plotting, fuming. He had been careless after the Great Train Robbery, too casual with the money, too sure of himself. But Ronnie Biggs wasn't built to crumble. Even as the walls closed in, even as the routines and the rules tried to crush him, he stayed sharp. He worked whatever prison jobs he could get, watched and listened, studied the guards, mapped the rhythms of the prison life with a gambler's eye. The plan came together slowly, like a slow leak turning into a flood. He smuggled parts, whispered with trusted men, built his ladder rung by careful rung inside the prison workshops. July 1965 arrived with the heavy heat of an English summer. The night he chose was no accident. He moved under the cover of that thick, sticky darkness. His hands tore at the rope ladder, clambering upward, muscles straining, his heart hammering so loudly it almost deafened him. For one sickening moment he hung there, swinging and exposed, a perfect shot for any watchful screw who happened to glance up. But no shout came. Outside the walls, loyal friends waited with a van and a pocketful of dirty cash. He hauled himself over the top and dropped hard into freedom, the cold night air rushing against his skin like a slap to the face. The van door was already swinging open as he landed. Rough hands grabbed him, shoved him inside, and before his feet even found balance, they were tearing down dark streets toward a new life. Biggs didn't waste a second looking back at Wandsworth's towering walls shrinking in the distance. There was nothing left for him there but slow death. By the time the morning sun rose over London, the newspapers were screaming, the police were scrambling, and Ronnie Biggs, the audacious boy from Lambeth, who had dared to laugh in the face of a judge, had disappeared like smoke. He wouldn't stay hidden for long, of course. Men like Ronnie never do. But for now, Paris was waiting, and with it, new faces, new plans, and a chance to reshape himself into something the law wouldn't recognise. Paris was supposed to be the beginning of a new life. Ronnie Biggs, the cocky lad from Lambeth, the man who had slipped the noose at Wandsworth, landed in France with dreams bigger than any police dragnet. He moved through the back streets and cheap hotels like a ghost, changing names as often as he changed coats. In dim apartments that smelled of cigarettes and stale coffee, he plotted a future that would keep him 2 steps ahead of the law. The plastic surgeons of Paris didn't ask too many questions. With a thick wad of cash, a man could buy a new chin, a straighter nose, a different face reflected back at him in the cracked mirrors of dingy clinics. Biggs endured the pain, the swelling, the slow reassembly of his identity, because he knew that if he looked the same, they would find him. He emerged from those rooms battered and bruised, but different enough to board a ship without a second glance. Australia loomed on the horizon, a vast faraway place where a man could melt into the dust and be forgotten. He sailed first to Bombay, keeping his head down, clinging to the edges of the world, then found his way across to Australia, stepping onto the sun-scorched streets of Adelaide with a heart full of hope and a head buzzing with caution. At first it was bliss. Biggs took work where he could find it, using fake names and fake histories. He lived a half-life, always careful, always listening for the footstep behind him that might mean the end. But loneliness gnawed at him. He couldn't live in hiding forever, not without something or someone to anchor him. Word reached his wife Charmian, still back in England, living under the heavy cloud of police surveillance and press hounds. Against every shred of sense, against every warning siren blaring in her mind, she made the decision to join him. They crossed oceans to be together, dragging their children into the chaos, believing somehow they could build a real life on a foundation of lies. For a while, Adelaide felt like a sanctuary. The children laughed in the parks. Ronnie played the part of the simple tradesman, his days filled with small jobs, and his nights thick with dreams of growing old in anonymity. But the noose was tightening. The world was getting smaller, the wanted posters reaching farther, the faces of the law turning up in the most unexpected places. It wasn't just the British police anymore. Interpol had marked him, and the Australians were quietly closing the gaps. In 1969, the dream cracked wide open. A slip, a whisper, a phone call in the wrong pub, and Ronnie Biggs knew he was living on borrowed time. He gathered what little he could, said goodbye to any hope of a normal life, and ran again. This time he aimed even farther. Brazil, wild, corrupt, sprawling, offered the kind of chaos in which a man like Biggs could disappear entirely. He moved fast, barely pausing to breathe, slipping through fingers that should have closed around him a dozen times. By the time the Australian authorities realised he was gone, he was already halfway to Rio de Janeiro, the golden city that glittered like a promise in the hot South American sun. On Copacabana's shimmering sands, under the broken neon lights and endless samba rhythms, Ronnie Biggs found a place where law and order were just distant, not the heavy, brutal certainties they had been back home. He shaved his head, learned a little Portuguese, melted into the thrumming heartbeat of a city that didn't care where you came from, only that you had a few coins to spend and a good story to tell. But even in Rio, paradise came at a price. The streets were teeming with informants. The British were patient. And Ronnie Biggs knew that he could only dance in the shadows for so long before the lights found him again. By the early 70s, Ronnie Biggs had managed what most men on the run only dreamed of. He had turned into a ghost. Brazil had swallowed him whole. In the steamy haze of Rio, he was just another foreigner with a funny accent, blending into the swirling mass of street vendors, musicians, drifters, and dreamers. He nursed beers in beachside bars, learned the rhythms of samba, made friends with small-time crooks and grand schemers alike. For the first time in years, Ronnie Biggs could walk the streets without a disguise, and nobody gave him a second glance. He even carved out a strange kind of fame, a legend whispered in the cafes and clubs. The Englishman who had outfoxed Scotland Yard, the great train robber who had beaten the system. But back home, they hadn't forgotten. Not Scotland Yard and not Jack Slipper. Detective Chief Superintendent Jack Slipper, known to the boys in blue as Slipper of the Yard, was a bulldog of a man. Relentless, tireless, and obsessed. He had built his name chasing the heavy hitters, and nothing gnawed at him more than the thought of Ronnie Biggs living the high life on some foreign beach, laughing at British justice. Slipper made it personal. He wanted Biggs back in chains, and he didn't care how. In 1974, the hunt exploded into madness. 2 British ex-soldiers, mercenaries more than lawmen, plotted a rogue operation to snatch Biggs off the streets of Rio. It was crude, it was desperate. It was exactly the kind of thing that could work in a place where a fistful of crumpled notes could still bend the law. One sticky, furious afternoon they struck. Biggs, ever the creature of habit, was lounging outside a favourite haunt when they grabbed him, bundling him into the back of a car with all the subtlety of a pub brawl. He fought, kicked, swore, tore skin from his knuckles against the inside of the door, but the muscle and surprise were too much. They drove him hard through the city's tangled veins, heading for a waiting boat, the plan being to haul him out to international waters, where the long fingers of British law could snatch him back. Biggs, bruised and battered, felt the old cold thrill of fear he thought he had outrun. It was happening. The chase was back on. But Rio was not England. The boat never made it far. Brazilian police, tipped off by a friend of Biggs, or perhaps a curious dock worker, swarmed the docks, guns drawn, voices hard. The kidnappers fled. Biggs, half conscious, bloodied but breathing, was hauled back to the city and into the arms of the media. He woke up famous. Brazil, with its aversion to extraditing the parents of Brazilian children, had just become his fortress, and Biggs, with a Brazilian girlfriend pregnant with his child, had just played the greatest card of all without even meaning to. Jack Slipper arrived soon after, teeth bared, warrants in hand, sure that now, finally, Ronnie Biggs would be crated up and sent home. But Slipper didn't understand Brazil. He didn't understand the power of spectacle, the way the locals had taken Biggs to heart, the rogue, the outlaw, the man who had made the mighty British Empire look foolish. Instead of a quiet handover, Slipper found himself blocked at every turn by politicians, by courts, by public opinion. But every press conference turned into a circus, every appeal was laughed out of court, and Ronnie Biggs, grinning like a cat who had swallowed the canary, sat back and watched his enemy drown in red tape. In the end, Slipper had to leave Rio empty-handed, fuming. Biggs stayed, sunburnt and smiling, raising his son under the lazy golden skies of Brazil, knowing that the whole world wanted him, but couldn't touch him. Ronnie Biggs didn't just survive in Brazil, he flourished. Some men go underground and vanish. Biggs, somehow, became larger than life. The outlaw who had slipped the noose, danced through the fingers of Scotland Yard, and built a kingdom under the samba sun. As the 1970s slid into the 1980s, Rio itself seemed to embrace him. It was a city that understood survival, that loved a rascal, that saw in Biggs not a criminal but a kindred spirit, a man who had beaten the odds and then sat down to enjoy the view. And so the myth grew. British tourists, hearing the whispers, would ask taxi drivers to take them to Biggs's favourite bars. Journalists would sniff around the beach cafes, looking for the pale Englishman with the crooked smile and the easy laugh. Some even got their souvenir, a photograph with Biggs, a signature scrawled on a beer mat, a story to take home. And Biggs, never one to pass up a good thing, leaned right into it. He cut records with punk bands. He charged for interviews. He posed for photos with armfuls of women, raising a glass, a living, breathing, two-fingered salute to every courtroom he had ever dodged. By the early 80s, Biggs had become something more than an outlaw. He had become an icon. Rock stars called him up. Television crews begged for sit-down interviews. His name was dropped in songs, scrawled across bathroom walls, whispered into microphones in sweaty nightclubs from London to New York. And back home, he was a symbol. For some, a symbol of injustice, the one that got away. For others, a folk hero, a last gasp of the cheeky, working-class rebel, flipping the bird at a system rigged for the rich and the powerful. Ronnie Biggs had turned exile into empire. But nothing lasts forever. The years wore on, the money thinned, the body began to betray him. The pace he had once kept slipping through his fingers like the shifting sands of Copacabana. The world, which once cheered his defiance, started to forget. The city which once shielded him grew indifferent, and somewhere, deep inside, Biggs knew the final chapter was coming. The years were not kind to Ronnie Biggs. The sun that had once bathed him in golden exile now beat down like a hammer. His body, so long his accomplice, turned traitor. First it was small things, a limp, a cough that wouldn't leave. Then it was worse, strokes, infections, hospitals. His once cheeky grin sagged into a grimace of pain. By the late 90s, Biggs was a relic in Rio, a broken man in a borrowed land. The tourists still came sometimes, wide-eyed and eager, snapping photos with the legendary train robber. But it wasn't the same anymore. The legend was fading. He could feel it. And deep down, he knew. It was time to go home. Not for glory, not for forgiveness, but to die on English soil. It was the Sun newspaper that made the arrangement. Always hungry for a headline, they paid Biggs to come back, to turn his surrender into a media circus. Wheelchair-bound, skin like crumpled paper, Ronnie Biggs was flown back across the Atlantic in 2001, the world watching with morbid fascination. The outlaw was going home, not in chains, but in surrender. At Heathrow Airport, police waited. The cheers of Rio were replaced by cold, clipped instructions. There were no brass bands, no ticker tape parades, only handcuffs and the heavy, leaden tread of justice finally catching up after all those years. In court, the sentence was swift. 30 years. No romance, no jokes, no last-minute pleas. Just the law, heavy and pitiless, slamming down at last. Biggs was sent to Belmarsh, a high-security prison built for men far more dangerous than a tired old train robber. He wheeled himself through the grey corridors, half laughed at the absurdity of it. He had run halfway across the world, danced through decades of freedom, only to end up here, a ghost among murderers and madmen. But time, the old conspirator, had one more favour for Ronnie Biggs. His health crumbled fast behind bars. Public pressure grew. Calls for his release echoed in Parliament, in the tabloids, in pubs across Britain. He was no threat, they said. Let him go. and in 2009, after years of dragging his broken body from hospital bed to prison cot, Ronnie Biggs was granted compassionate release. They wheeled him out into the weak English sun, a free man once again, but only barely alive. Ronnie Biggs died on December 18th, 2013, at the age of 84. Not in a cell, not in Rio, but in a small room in East Barnet, North London. A man who had lived 100 lives, outrun 100 jailers, charmed 1,000 strangers, and laughed in the face of fate until the very end. Some called him a criminal, some called him a legend. But Ronnie Biggs, he was always just himself, the lad from Lambeth, who robbed a train, stole a fortune, and stole even more years than anyone ever thought he could.